You know, many of the world's mysteries have already been solved. But scientists like these here at the Patuxent Environmental Science Center know that our journey of discovery has just begun. Welcome to Anatomy of a Lesson. On today's program, we're going to see the diverse ways that scientists make observations and then record and display the data that result. And for those of you that think that students don't make good pioneering scientists, after today's program, you might just think differently. Science for the record, today on Anatomy of a Lesson.
It seems that everywhere you look, data are on display. Charts and graphs of every variety are visual reminders of the cyclical nature of life, from what birds are breeding best to how likely it is for hurricanes to happen, to whether or not we're winning the Battle of the Bulge. But before any patterns emerge from the data, it has to be collected first. And the methods for doing so, especially when a monster of a mammal is involved, are often far from mundane.
We've used radio telemetry techniques to monitor manatees along especially the east coast of Florida. This involves attaching a radio transmitter to a belt around the base of the tail. This transmitter is able to broadcast to a satellite, and using Service Argos, a location and data collection service, we're able to download through a computer locations and sensor information.
Because of their preference for warm waters, manatees generally stay close to home in Florida. But for 2 years in a row, one has taken a summer vacation far to the north. Nicknamed Chessie for getting stranded in Chesapeake Bay, the slippery sea cow had to be caught and then airlifted home. But now the veteran traveler can swim home alone, and in the process has provided valuable data to wildlife biologists who know they have a manatee by the tail.
We look for changes in locations to document movements, persistent use in certain areas to document site fidelity and habitat use. But we also use the sensor information that comes with the service in order to look at water temperatures, transmitter activity, and even dive information for the transmitter.
Unlike the manatee, elephants are not yet an endangered species. In fact, in some parts of Africa and Southeast Asia, their destructive eating habits have turned pachyderms into pests. So in an attempt to control the wild herds, satellite technology is again being used for gathering data on Dumbo.
And so with this radio collar, we hope to have the location of it beamed up to the satellite, beamed down to a readout here in the zoo, so we can actually talk about translocation, talk about the problems of conservation and the conflict between human and elephant populations in Malaysia, and really demonstrate that directly to the public in an interactive way. This kind of high-tech approach where you can actually get satellite data accurate literally to the minute, to the site, is tremendous boon for doing all sorts of different kinds of studies, population studies, movement studies. You can follow them at night, which is pretty hard to do with elephants, and there's been very few studies of elephants at night, where they go, what they do. So it provides you a whole new realm of study.
On lumbering giants, radio collars are merely a nuisance. But on birds, such instruments can compromise their ability to fly. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has long monitored changing duck and goose populations by aerial surveys and sampling methods. But for those large birds, and especially for the small, it's observations made during banding and recapture that provide volumes of vital statistics, including who's who.
The most important thing, of course, is the species. What type of bird does it happen to be? And that's often surprisingly difficult to figure out during the fall. Some of these birds really require a lot of expertise to identify. Some of the migrating flycatchers, during the breeding season, you can identify them by song. But during the fall, it becomes a lot more difficult, and you have to rely on measurements of the wing or some of the more obscure plumage characteristics to actually figure out what they are.
Some of a bird's most revealing information is kept under feathered wraps. To determine if a bird has fed well enough to sustain itself on long migratory flights, for instance, scientists check for a healthy layer of yellow fat beneath the skin of the breast. And by looking through the thin skin atop the head, scientists can determine if it's a sweet bird of youth. As in human children, a young bird's skull bones have not yet fused. Coupled with banding information, these are data that help gauge a species' longevity and lifestyle.
If you really want to make a statement about bird populations, you have to collect good information. And that's surprisingly difficult for birds. And banding provides a really unique way of getting at some things about bird populations that you really can't get at in any other way. For one thing, if you catch a bird and you put a band on it, you know that that bird was at that location at that time. And if you either see the bird again somewhere else, or if somebody else finds the band on the bird at some other location and mails it back to the bird banding lab here, we have a little bit of information on where the birds go, where they're spending the winter maybe, or maybe where they're breeding if we band them during the winter.
Whether it's based on satellites or sight alone, data ultimately depend on human interpretation. From the earliest astronomers who calculated the orbital periods of planets, to the Italian mathematician who saw symmetry in nature and explained the rarity of four-leaf clovers, it is keen observation that leads to scientific breakthrough.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
The regular patterns that appear in nature are no mere coincidence. But it wasn't until the 1100s that Leonardo of Pisa, better known as Fibonacci, revealed that the number of petals on a flower or branches on a tree followed a strict mathematical formula. Wherever Fibonacci looked, the final tally was either 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, a sequence determined by the addition of the two preceding numbers.
It just seems to be a nice growth pattern, a pattern of regular growth. The rate of growth, the rate of increase is a standard number that keeps things from growing lopsided. Scientists are interested in differences, they're also interested in similarities, and a Fibonacci sequence is a way of determining if something is following a regular pattern or not.
Looking for common features is particularly important for taxonomists. As new organisms continue to be discovered, scientists look for anatomical similarities when assigning classification groups. The differences are often so minute, however, that even professionals can't distinguish among would-be species. But a new initiative has enlisted school children in the scientific name game. Known as Tom Sawyer Science, some students were recently recruited by a scientist who found that youthful inexperience can be a virtue.
The key is finding somebody who has a problem that's difficult to solve. So you don't want somebody who already knows the answer. You want to look for a scientist who has a problem that he or she doesn't quite know how to solve and who's willing to relinquish that problem and accept that some students or teachers might actually find the answer to that problem. And it's a way to potentially support science, to contribute really new observations and new data to help solve real scientific problems.
The problem for a group of elementary school students was to identify unique patterns on the wings of previously unknown fruit flies. The task of which fly was which confounded taxonomists, but the children passed this entomological Rorschach test with flying colors.
And so I took pictures of a series, which is exactly what a taxonomist in a museum does, is you look at a series of 20 individuals of species A, 20 of species B, and then test your hypothesis. Which one of those many differences allows you to consistently identify A as different from B? And so I just threw the set of cards back to the kids and said, okay, you guys have all these amazing hypotheses, now you tell me. And they did.
By discovering wing splotch patterns that no one else had seen, the students of Manchester Elementary School were following in Fibonacci's footsteps. They had clearly identified a new species of fruit fly, and as a reward, gained a measure of scientific immortality.
There's Blepharonura manchesteri, and this is the first record in taxonomic history of anyone naming a species after an elementary school.
I think this points out one of the basic truths in science instruction and science thinking, the fact that if you're confronted with a genuine problem, a question that's real, and the children are given a chance to examine those data and to draw patterns and conclusions from what they see, they're engaged in that, they're interested. And I think that children are perhaps the ideal scientists in that respect. They are innocent and open to things that they may see that others might otherwise overlook.
When students are making observations, they're actually following the recommendations in the newly released National Science Education Standards, which specify that students in grades K through 4 should be using simple tools and equipment to gather data and extend their senses. In grades 5 through 8, students should actually be beyond the gathering of data and go to their analysis and interpretation. And by the higher grades, students should be using technology for collecting and manipulating their data. It is a math revival in science classes that is long overdue.
I think we should incorporate mathematics, but I'm a statistician and I think we should incorporate statistics. That is really data analysis, because science teachers and students collect a lot of data. Every time they go in a laboratory, they're generating data and analyzing those data, and that's a rich opportunity for them to apply some quantitative reasoning skills, making some simple graphs, looking at what the data have to say, and then trying to figure out, given what the data, what the distribution was of the data, what does that say about the underlying scientific phenomena that they're studying.
Workshops sponsored by organizations like the American Statistical Association are giving science teachers new ways of displaying student data. As a result, their vocabulary is changing, and stem and leaf, for instance, are no longer just botanical terms.
Well, there are some relatively simple graphical techniques in the realm that statisticians call exploratory data analysis, which is, as you said, stem and leaf diagrams as a simple way to organize raw data, a box plot as a way to give a visual summary of both the center, that is the median, because we prefer to look at the median rather than the average. And then a box plot also tells you what the distribution is, how much variability is there. A scatter diagram, scatter plot to look at relationships between two variables. And then simply fitting a line on a scatter plot to show what's the linear trend as the volume goes up, the mass goes up, and the slope of that line is the density.
As science teachers become more comfortable with data manipulation, so too do their students. New mathematical models that promote inquiry and exploration are being introduced to the laboratory. So despite some appearances, it is not cookbook science anymore. At the National Center for Health Statistics in Hyattsville, Maryland, doctors and mathematicians take the pulse of the nation. In tallying up how well we fare from the cradle to the grave, the center demonstrates that the guidelines for gathering data are a science unto themselves.
The National Center for Health Statistics' mission is to monitor the nation's health, and we do that in several ways. First of all, we are the lead agency to collect statistics on the health of the population. We do this through collecting vital statistics. We have the National Death Index. We collect all the vital records on births and deaths, marriage and divorce, and we collate this and provide this data for the states and for policymakers in the federal government. We have all the information that you see in doctor's offices on cholesterol. What is the average cholesterol in the United States? I think most people have seen all the information that's come out on body measurements, that the U.S. population is getting heavier, and that comes from our survey. Actually, what's interesting about this survey, besides health, it's used for other purposes like dress sizes, size of suits. The garment industry will use the data to actually know what the average person is like, so they know how to gear sizes.
To collect the data that appear in the center's national survey, carefully selected patients complete detailed questionnaires and are given thorough physicals at mobile units around the country that include everything from gallbladder ultrasounds to calculations of bone density. But for the results to be valid, health workers must be constantly alert to the pitfalls of sampling. The measurement and response biases that can nullify a national survey can be just as damaging to a census in a classroom.
I think it's a great idea for science teachers to actually look at surveys, to do that as an experiment instead of doing the usual, test tube types of studies, because it provides really good information and it's really what the Public Health Service does.
Standard survey techniques include selecting a sampling frame, for instance, the height and weight of students in a high school. Second, remember to stratify the frame by age or grade or some other variable. Third, randomly pick the participants within each survey group. Next, choose a sample size large enough to ensure a standard level of precision, normally 95% accuracy. And last, always account for non-response bias, those people within the group that choose not to participate.
You know, in many ways, data are only as good as they look. If the format chosen to display information doesn't provide clear labeling, or if the trends aren't obvious, then the chances for graphic gratification are pretty low. Some of the best and most sophisticated displays of data are the box plots and scatter diagrams that we looked at earlier. Unfortunately, those are still mostly confined to scientific journals, but perhaps not for long.
We're looking forward to the day when you see more and more of this kind of thing in the newspaper or in magazines. Sometimes we'll see a pie chart of that sort of thing in a magazine. Pie chart really not a very good graphical technique from my point of view. There are better ways to graphically display data that are easier to construct and we think are more informative.
Some of the most clever displays of data appear on the newspaper pages of USA Today. With bright colors and often a sense of humor, their informational graphics are designed to appeal to and inform the reader in a hurry. Like cartoons, they're effective by being no more than what meets the eye.
In cartooning, you have to get right to the point, simplify, do things visually with as few words as possible, and it has to have some sort of clever twist. And the same with informational graphics. They're meant to, as soon as you look at them, you sort of understand them, whether you want to read the text or not.
For students trying to capture a judge's attention at the science fair, the graphic style at USA Today can be a rich source of statistical suggestions.
What helps with informational graphics is you're not looking at a blank piece of paper, for one. You are starting with information, and it's very clear the point you need to get across. And that's something that helps us with concepts so much, is we keep asking ourselves, what is the point of this? What is the point? What is the point? Because sometimes you can get off track with your artwork, and you can fall in love with your own artwork and with an idea, and you try to kind of force the idea into the content instead of letting the content drive the idea.
Wherever the insect eats, it'll eat the bacteria. Because if you just put it in one spot, the insect can avoid it. All right, and it won't die. It has to eat it to die, so you want it to spread it as evenly as possible so the insect will eat it and it will die. Okay?
Results from an experiment can be misinterpreted, but it's not likely that 1,000 insects can be wrong. To get students to record good data, an experiment that includes a large randomly selected sample and turns the laboratory into a killing field can be an excellent teacher. As they set out to determine which concentration of a natural pesticide would be most effective at destroying the hornworm, a class of 5th graders joined forces, Tom Sawyer style, with a research scientist. And to prepare for their chemical battle with the tomato-eating pests, the rookie detectives had to learn all the right moves, from pipetting like a professional, to setting up controls, to stringing along a hornworm using its own silk. And as the students watched and recorded which of the worms had turned, they became both environmentally conscious and statistically savvy.
The whole point of data analysis is that it makes students think about how they can best convey what they've learned. If they can do an experiment like the hornworm investigation, for which there are no right answers, and then graphically display it so that someone else can understand what happened, they've not only learned something about hornworms and the scientific method, but they've learned something about communication as well. And that's just as important a goal.
So as teachers plot ways to increase their students' quantitative literacy, they're finding that the manipulation of data can be an important first step. Combined with cooperative learning strategies, higher order thinking skills, and just the right bugs, students can increase their scientific literacy as well. Thanks for joining us today on Anatomy of a Lesson.